No one could have known that the morning of June 18th, 1815 would become the day that changed not only Europe, but the very architecture of history. Yet in this version of reality, where a single shot is fired a second later, where a cloud delays the rain by only a few minutes, where a lone messenger reaches the right commander just in time, the world receives a completely different scenario. This is the story of what would have happened if Napoleon Bonaparte had won at Waterloo. A truth we never saw, but one that could easily have been ours. The mist over the fields of Waterloo hung heavier than usual, as if nature itself refused to reveal what was about to unfold. French corps moved like a single organism, so precise it was as though they were guided by the pure logic of war. The soldiers did not know they were standing on the threshold of the most important battle of their lives. They only knew that at their center stood a man they called Emperor, a man whose confidence, whose immovable resolve, whose ability to see the battlefield as a grand chessboard had made Europe tremble for years. And in this reality, one change, small, almost invisible, decided everything. Couriers sent to Marshal Grouchy reached him on time. He received the order that, in our world, he got far too late. His corps turned from its route and marched toward Waterloo, which meant that the Prussian army under Gebhard von Blücher did not arrive in time, did not strike the decisive flank blow, did not deliver the fatal moment that in our history sealed the emperor's fate. This tiny shift, unnoticed by common soldiers, sent ripples through history like a gentle push at the base of a towering structure. Barely visible at first, but moments later, everything begins to fall. Hours on the battlefield stretched endlessly. The English army under the Duke of Wellington held its ground, but French columns pressed closer, breaking the defense line by line. Ney's cavalry struck with such fury it seemed destiny itself urged them toward one final surge. Smoke covered the sun, and each new volley sounded like a shot fired into another dimension. But the most decisive moment came when Wellington finally noticed what he feared most: the French right wing strengthening. Grouchy had arrived. The British forces were caught in a tightening vice. By evening, the truth became undeniable. The battle was lost. Wellington, who had stood almost motionless all day, like a carved monument, finally admitted defeat. He gave the order to retreat, but the order came too late. French troops burst through the center. British lines collapsed. Panic swept through the soldiers like a storm. Wellington barely escaped alive. On a distant hill, faint through the smoke, Napoleon raised his spyglass. He did not smile, not yet. He never allowed himself to celebrate early, but the long years of defeats, exile, humiliation, the forced retreat to Elba, all of it seemed to dissolve. He slowly lowered the spyglass and only then issued the order, "Pursue, but do not destroy." He wanted not blood, but effect. He turned to his officers and said that Europe must see his return as inevitable. He needed not annihilation, but submission. But victory at Waterloo was only the beginning of a new era. Within days, London fell into shock. Newspapers printed headlines no one had imagined: Bonaparte triumphs. The Bank of England desperately tried to stabilize the pound. The government held an emergency session where, for the first time in decades, the question was not how to contain France, but how to save the British Empire. Prussia drowned in panic. Austria sank into deep concern. Russia summoned accelerated military councils. But Napoleon did not rush forward as many expected. He did not want another endless war. He wanted to build a Europe where he was the center of gravity, where he was the architect of a new world order. As Europe struggled to process what had happened, Paris rejoiced. People filled the streets, believing the emperor had returned forever. Lights shone through the windows, music poured over the squares. Yet Napoleon sat in silence inside his office. Before him lay a map of Europe. He traced France's borders with his finger, then Germany's, then Italy's. He understood that victory was only the start of a chain reaction. Victory required structure. Victory required design. He wrote the first letters, diplomatic, measured. He knew Britain was too weak now to continue fighting. He understood Prussia would move cautiously. He knew Austria, always wavering between fear and pragmatism, would seek compromise. And he sensed that Russia, the only truly dangerous opponent, would simply wait, observe, calculate. This was the moment when France gained a rare opportunity to cleanse itself of past defeats, to rewrite the balance of power, and to shape what historians in this alternate reality would later call the new European order. And here, at this very point, something extraordinary began. Napoleon understood that he needed not the energy of soldiers, nor the fury of generals, nor cannons or cavalry. He needed economics. He needed allies. He needed ideas. He summoned people whom history in our world had forgotten: engineers, philosophers, reformers, jurists. He gathered them in Paris as ancient rulers once gathered sages before birthing a new civilization. He sought not an empire, but a system. He initiated what, in our timeline, never happened: a reform of Europe in which France was the core, but not a tyrant, a leader, but not an oppressor. And while this new order was only beginning to take shape, a quiet sense of fear drifted across Europe. People felt that something larger was awakening, that a single battlefield victory had triggered a process destined to reshape the entire planet. But no one yet understood how far the consequences of Napoleon's victory at Waterloo would reach. No one foresaw that this triumph would create a completely different Europe, one without British dominance, one in which the Industrial Revolution would follow a different path, where colonial empires would reorganize in new patterns, where the United States would face a different global balance, and where the very idea of modern civilization would evolve into something else. No one yet understood that the world was stepping into an era historians would one day call the Napoleonic Renaissance. And this is only the beginning.
And so, as the smoke of the battlefield settles over the quiet Belgian fields, the new reality of Europe under Napoleon's victorious command begins to take shape. What unfolds in the months following the triumph at Waterloo is not merely a political recalibration, but a tectonic shift in the trajectory of Western civilization. The first shockwaves ripple through London, where ministers gather in emergency councils, sensing that the balance of power painstakingly built over decades has evaporated in a single afternoon. The news of Wellington's defeat sends tremors across the British Empire, prompting a frantic reassessment of colonial defenses and economic strategy, as the nation realizes that the French emperor, once driven into exile, may soon dictate terms to them rather than merely across the continent. Paris, meanwhile, becomes the pulsing center of renewed imperial ambition. The capital erupts into days of jubilant celebration, its boulevards echoing with cheers, the tricolor banners unfurling from every balcony. But beneath the euphoria lies a profound new certainty. Napoleon's political resurrection is complete, and his vision for Europe will no longer be constrained by coalitions or diplomatic containment. He convenes an emergency council of ministers, marshals, and advisors, outlining a sweeping blueprint for reshaping the continent. His plan is neither reckless nor purely militaristic. It is a structured fusion of enlightened governance and imperial authority, a strategy intended not only to consolidate his rule, but to secure France's dominance for generations. The first step in this systematic transformation is the neutralization of Britain as a continental influencer. Napoleon understands that he cannot invade the island, nor does he intend to. Instead, he aims to carve the European market away from British influence, forging a tighter, more efficient, and more strictly enforced continental system, one no longer weakened by internal dissent or wavering alliances. With Prussia crushed and Austria fully subdued after Waterloo's aftermath, compliance becomes absolute, enforced through a combination of diplomatic restructuring and military deterrence. The economic consequences ripple outward. British manufacturing faces unprecedented strain as European ports close in unison, leaving warehouses overflowing and merchants desperate for alternate markets. But while France expands its economic grip, Napoleon turns his attention to systemic reforms within the territories now brought firmly under imperial authority. The Napoleonic Code, already established across parts of Europe, becomes the foundation for a new legal and administrative unification. It standardizes property rights, modernizes civil procedures, and reorganizes governance in a way that dissolves archaic feudal structures across German states, northern Italy, and the Netherlands. The continental mosaic begins to resemble a coherent imperial federation rather than a loose collection of dependent states. This legal transformation is one of the most enduring consequences of Napoleon's hypothetical victory. Its influence reverberates through future generations, altering the relationship between citizens and the state in ways the real 19th century never saw unified so quickly or so comprehensively. Yet the most profound changes arise in the geopolitical architecture Napoleon now sets in motion. Freed from the constant pressure of coalition warfare, he redirects resources toward modernization rather than mere survival. The Imperial University expands its reach, pouring funding into engineering academies, military science, and industrial innovation. France's rail infrastructure, which in real history lagged behind Britain's, begins accelerating drastically under centralized imperial planning. Incentives are offered to inventors and industrialists, while espionage networks extend across Europe to acquire technologies and techniques that might strengthen the empire's competitive edge. Within a decade, the French industrial landscape starts catching up to Britain's, and in some regions, surpassing it, creating a multipolar industrial revolution rather than the British-centric model known today. Meanwhile, in Russia, Alexander I watches the French resurgence with a mixture of suspicion and resignation. Napoleon, understanding the risks of renewed conflict in the East, pursues a cautious diplomatic approach. Rather than forcing a confrontation, he seeks a long-term stabilization, offering trade privileges, territorial clarifications, and a sphere of influence agreement that keeps Russia from rejoining any anti-French coalition. Although these negotiations are tense, they mark the beginning of a uniquely balanced Franco-Russian relationship, one neither fully allied nor openly hostile, but strategically cooperative. This détente prevents the catastrophic 1812 invasion from ever taking place, preserving millions of lives and altering the demographic future of Eastern Europe. Within France's dominion, the cultural renaissance ignited by victory at Waterloo becomes a defining feature of the new imperial era. Artists, writers, philosophers, and scientists, all previously constrained by the turbulence of endless warfare, find themselves in an environment of stability and ambition. The imperial court encourages vast cultural projects that glorify the era and project the image of France as the intellectual nucleus of Europe. Historical academies begin documenting not only the empire's achievements, but the anthropological and scientific discoveries brought back from global expeditions sponsored by Napoleon's revitalized exploration committees. This imperial patronage shapes a European identity more centered around Paris than London, shifting the cultural axis of the continent. As decades pass, the map of Europe evolves into a political constellation that would have seemed impossible before Waterloo. The Confederation of the Rhine transforms into a semi-autonomous imperial bloc, functioning similarly to what would one day become the European Union, but under French hegemony rather than collective governance. Italy, unified decades earlier under French guidance, becomes an industrial and cultural partner in the empire's southern flank. Spain, though still resistant to French authority, enters a pragmatic arrangement, exchanging greater regional autonomy for integration into the continental economic system. The Ottoman Empire, observing the changing balance of power, begins engaging more directly with French advisors, hoping to modernize its institutions and military structure before geopolitical fractures threaten its territorial integrity. But the most dramatic consequence of Napoleon's victory manifests in the global order beyond Europe. The Americas, witnessing a Europe governed not by fracturing monarchies, but by a coherent imperial system, alter their timelines of independence. French support for revolutionary movements in Latin America grows more pronounced, both as a means of undermining British influence and as a philosophical extension of Napoleonic legal ideals. The fragmentation of Spanish and Portuguese colonies continues, but with France guiding diplomatic and military developments, new republics emerge, with civil structures more aligned to Napoleonic governance than to Anglo-American models. This reshaping of the Western Hemisphere influences economic networks, political alliances, and the dissemination of technological advancements throughout the 19th century. Across the globe, the British Empire endures, though now forced to operate in an increasingly competitive multipolar environment. India remains its most valuable possession, but British influence in Asia becomes contested by a French empire eager to expand scientific missions, naval presence, and commercial networks. The result is a 19th century defined not by British dominance, but by a persistent strategic rivalry between the two superpowers, each striving for global influence without descending into direct conflict. This balance prevents unilateral imperial monopolies and accelerates technological development, as each side pushes for supremacy in science, industry, and military innovation. As we move deeper into this alternate timeline, the social fabric of Europe transforms under the prolonged stability of Napoleonic governance. Without the series of devastating wars that historically reshaped borders, economic resources are reallocated towards social programs, infrastructure, and education. Literacy rates climb faster than in the real timeline, and technological experimentation spreads through state-sponsored initiatives. Urban centers expand with improved planning, sanitation, and transportation systems, creating megacities decades ahead of their real-world counterparts. Public health advances emerge earlier, due to centralized scientific coordination, reducing mortality rates and accelerating population growth. All of these changes culminate in a mid-19th century Europe that is vastly more unified, industrially advanced, and globally influential than the one history delivered. Underneath this transformation lies the core question: how does a world shaped by Napoleon's victory at Waterloo?
As the new Napoleonic era matures, the continent enters a period that historians of this alternate timeline later describe as the imperial consolidation. It is a period defined not by conquest, but by the extraordinary effort required to turn a military victory into a sustainable political architecture. Napoleon, acutely aware that empires collapse not from external pressure, but from internal disintegration, invests his energy into designing institutions capable of outliving him. That urgency stems from his own experience. He understands the fragility of power built solely on battlefield success, and so his focus shifts toward weaving the empire into the daily lives, aspirations, and identities of millions of Europeans. The imperial administrative network expands into a sophisticated bureaucracy built on meritocracy, surveillance, and the efficiency of centralized oversight. Yet beneath the rigidity lies a revolutionary ethos, the belief that social mobility must be accessible to all citizens loyal to the empire, regardless of birth or class. Through schools, military academies, and civil service examinations, a new generation of Europeans rises to positions of influence based on competence rather than lineage. This reshaping of the elite structure becomes one of the enduring hallmarks of the Napoleonic century, challenging the aristocratic foundations of old Europe and fostering a technocratic ruling class decades ahead of its time. Meanwhile, the financial backbone of the empire undergoes sweeping reforms. The Banque de France, strengthened by new European contributions, becomes the central institution of a continent-wide monetary system. Standardized currencies begin circulating across imperial territories, promoting commerce and reducing economic fragmentation. Trade corridors spanning from Lisbon to Warsaw are linked by unified taxation policies and infrastructural investment. The effect is profound. Europe evolves into the world's most integrated economic region long before the idea of a common market would emerge in real history. This cohesion attracts entrepreneurs, industrialists, and inventors seeking stable conditions to pursue ambitious projects that require long-term planning. One of the empire's most transformative policies is the acceleration of the continental railway network. Under Napoleon's directive, military engineers, freed from the demands of constant warfare, are reassigned to civilian infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. Rail lines cut across mountains, valleys, and borders, stitching the empire together with iron pathways that allow goods, soldiers, and citizens to move with speed unimaginable in earlier decades. These railways become not only logistical arteries, but symbols of the new era, monuments of steel representing strength, unity, and modernity. Their presence triggers urbanization, expands trade, and ultimately shifts demographic patterns as populations gravitate toward industrial centers thriving under imperial patronage. Yet alongside this industrial evolution, the cultural identity of Europe also undergoes a renaissance. Paris becomes the undisputed intellectual capital of the world. Imperial museums expand their collections, with artifacts brought back from archaeological expeditions in Egypt, the Levant, and Central Asia, missions that Napoleon funds under the banner of scientific advancement rather than colonial exploitation. The arts flourish under a structured but generous sponsorship system. Painters, composers, and playwrights produce works that both celebrate and critique the empire, revealing a nuanced cultural interplay that goes far beyond propaganda.
theaters across the continent stage productions that explore themes of ambition, fate, and progress, reflecting the era's intense self-awareness. Despite the growing prosperity, not all regions embrace the new order without resistance. Nationalist sentiments simmer beneath the surface, especially in areas with strong cultural traditions that resist assimilation. Napoleon, foreseeing the dangers of harsh suppression, seeks a different approach: integration through localized autonomy. He grants certain provinces the authority to maintain regional customs, languages, and internal governance structures, so long as they pledge political and military loyalty to the empire. This pragmatic federalism prevents widespread revolts and allows cultural diversity to coexist with central authority, creating a European mosaic underpinned by mutual economic benefits and legal uniformity. In the diplomatic sphere, the empire's influence grows steadily. The Treaty of Vienna, radically different from the historical version, transforms from a punitive measure against France into the charter of a continental federation led by the emperor. Austria, defeated militarily but preserved diplomatically, becomes one of the empire's most significant partners. Its aristocracy, recognizing the futility of resisting French power, integrates into the Napoleonic system, exchanging political sovereignty for stability, prestige, and access to imperial markets. Prussia, stripped of much of its political influence after Waterloo, shifts toward military and cultural reform, slowly evolving into a loyal but ambitious constituent kingdom within the French-led federation. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, French advisors introduced during the post-Waterloo era bring new doctrines of military science, engineering, and administrative reform. Inspired by the centralized efficiency of the Napoleonic state, the Ottomans modernize more rapidly than in the real historical timeline. This revitalization delays internal fragmentation and strengthens their ability to manage territorial pressures from Russia and Britain. The resulting alliance network across southeastern Europe stabilizes regions that historically suffered from constant instability, altering the geopolitical dynamics of the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. The decades following the consolidation phase witness a gradual generational transition. Napoleon's aging presence remains a powerful symbolic force, but younger leaders, educated in imperial academies and trained in philosophy, engineering, military science, and governance, begin shaping the next chapter of Europe. These individuals are not bound by the monarchic traditions of old, but by a shared belief in order, progress, and continental unity. Their worldview blends rationalism with ambition, emphasizing the expansion of knowledge, technology, and economic interconnectedness. In their minds, Europe is not merely an empire, it is a living organism destined to lead global civilization. This ideological shift radiates into education, where statewide curriculum reforms create a unified intellectual foundation across the empire. Students from Florence to Antwerp learn the same principles of mathematics, law, logic, and history, fostering a generation that speaks with a common cultural vocabulary while still retaining regional heritage. The empire becomes a laboratory of ideas, pushing the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and mechanical engineering through collaborative institutions that mirror what the world would one day call research universities. Early experiments with electricity, telegraphy, and steel refinement begin decades before their real-world counterparts, supported by imperial grants and international cooperation within the Federation. Outside Europe, the rise of the Napoleonic system triggers a complex response in global power structures. The Qing dynasty, observing France's rapid modernization, initiates cautious diplomatic exchanges intended to bolster its own technological development. Scientific missions travel between Beijing and Paris, creating the earliest form of East-West intellectual dialogue. In the United States, policymakers grow increasingly wary of European influence in Latin America and begin strengthening their navy, accelerating a militarization that historically developed later. This tension between American and French strategic interests sets the stage for a subtler, long-term rivalry, one rooted not in direct conflict, but in influence over emerging nations and global maritime routes. Back in Europe, Napoleon's eventual death becomes one of the most pivotal moments in this alternate timeline. His passing is not a chaotic collapse, but a carefully orchestrated transfer of power. The Napoleonic dynasty, strengthened over decades, transitions leadership to an heir groomed in governance rather than warfare. Comprehensive laws governing succession, constitutional authority, and regional representation smooth the transition, preventing civil unrest or fracturing. In a symbolic moment broadcast across the continent, the Imperial Council reaffirms its commitment to unity, continuity, and modernization, ensuring that the empire endures not as a cult of personality, but as an institutional colossus. By the mid-19th century, Europe under the Napoleonic order has become an unparalleled.
As the empire advances into the second half of the 19th century, its internal evolution begins to take on a new character. The generation born after Napoleon's victory at Waterloo has grown up in a Europe that has never experienced the fragmentation, economic stagnation, and ideological polarization that once shaped the historical timeline. Instead, they inhabit a continent where political unity is not merely a strategic necessity, but an inherited assumption about how civilization should function. This worldview profoundly shapes the intellectual climate of the era, giving rise to disciplines that combine empirical science with philosophical inquiry into the nature of progress, authority, and human destiny. Universities in Paris, Lyon, Vienna, and Milan become crucibles for new theories that explore the organization of society, the automation of labor, the ethics of industrialization, and the responsibilities of empire. The Industrial Revolution under Napoleonic rule does not unfold chaotically, nor is it driven by purely market dynamics. Instead, it becomes a managed transformation orchestrated by state planners, engineers, and industrialists who operate under imperial charters. The early adoption of standardized railway gauges, uniform commercial codes, and continent-wide resource distribution systems leads to rapid economies of scale. Coal from Silesia fuels factories in northern Italy, while steel from Lorraine is used in shipyards in Marseille and Thessaloniki. The empire begins constructing vast industrial corridors, transforming once agrarian regions into clusters of innovation that accelerate technological development far beyond historical timelines. One of the most significant breakthroughs occurs in the realm of communications. With the empire's infrastructure already designed for efficiency, engineers begin experimenting with long-distance signaling long before such innovations became feasible historically. The optical telegraph network implemented during Napoleon's early reign evolves into a hybrid system that integrates mechanical and electrical components. Imperial scientists, drawing from Franco-Austrian collaboration, produce a functional electromagnetic telegraph decades in advance, enabling rapid transmission of information across thousands of kilometers. This innovation compresses both time and space within the empire, allowing the central government to respond to crises, coordinate economic activity, and disseminate scientific discoveries with unprecedented speed. Communication also transforms the cultural landscape. Newspapers printed in multiple languages circulate across the continent, carrying shared narratives that bind diverse populations into a common historical consciousness.
artistic movements spread with ease, creating cross-regional collaborations that merge classical traditions with emerging industrial aesthetics. Music, once defined by national styles, becomes increasingly unified through imperial academies that blend French precision, German depth, and Italian melodic sensibility. The resulting cultural synthesis produces a distinctly Napoleonic aesthetic, grand in scale, rational in structure, and infused with a sense of civilizational mission. Yet behind this optimistic veneer lies a growing tension. The empire's remarkable success raises the critical question of political participation. The educated middle class, empowered by imperial meritocracy, begins to demand greater influence in shaping policy. They no longer accept a governance structure dominated solely by military aristocracy or bureaucratic elites. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, petitions, scholarly essays, and carefully organized public forums spread across major cities, articulating visions for constitutional reform. These movements are not revolutionary in a radical or violent sense. Instead, they seek to evolve the empire into a more representative system that can reflect its increasingly complex social fabric. The imperial government initially resists these pressures, wary that granting too much autonomy might destabilize the federation. However, it soon becomes clear that the demand for representation is not an isolated phenomenon, but a structural consequence of modernization itself. Industrial workers, engineers, scholars, and merchants all feel the effects of central economic planning, and many want the opportunity to influence the laws that shape their professional and personal lives. Recognizing the danger of ignoring these demands, the Imperial Council initiates a series of controlled reforms. New provincial assemblies are created with limited legislative powers, serving as political laboratories that test the empire's capacity for democratic participation without threatening the unity of central authority. The result is a delicate balance, a hybrid political system that blends imperial hierarchy with localized autonomy. This structure eventually evolves into a unique model of governance that historians later describe as guided technocratic federalism. Under this model, citizens gain representation through assemblies composed of elected delegates, while key positions in the central government remain reserved for experts, engineers, and administrators chosen through meritocratic examinations. The underlying belief is that political legitimacy requires both popular participation and professional competence, ensuring that ideological passions never overpower scientific reasoning and administrative expertise. Externally, the empire's dominance begins reshaping global dynamics in ways that were unimaginable in the original historical timeline. Russia, feeling increasingly isolated by the Napoleonic Federation and the modernization of the Ottoman territories, undergoes its own internal transformation. The Tsars recognize that resisting the empire militarily is futile, so they pursue a strategy of cautious alignment. Trade agreements are negotiated, joint scientific expeditions in Siberia are launched, and intellectual exchanges between universities in Paris and St. Petersburg become increasingly common. While tensions persist, especially over influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia, the relationship stabilizes enough to avoid open conflict, fostering an uneasy but productive coexistence. Meanwhile, Britain remains one of the few global powers capable of balancing the empire's influence. Its vast colonial network, naval supremacy, and financial strength provided with tools to counter French-led continental expansion without engaging in direct confrontation. Rather than seeking military dominance in Europe, Britain focuses on solidifying its global presence in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. This strategic divergence creates a bipolar world, a Napoleonic Europe that dominates the continent and technological innovation, and a British Empire that controls the oceans and global trade routes. This competition between these two systems fuels rapid advancements in shipbuilding, navigation, communication, and political thought, creating a 19th century defined by strategic rivalry rather than world war. One of the most fascinating consequences of this alternate timeline emerges in the field of science. With Europe unified and stable, and with massive state investment in education and research, the empire becomes the birthplace of scientific revolutions decades ahead of schedule. Early experiments in electromagnetism evolve into practical electrical systems used in cities and factories. Advances in chemistry lead to breakthroughs in medicine, fertilizers, and material science. Steam power, already widespread, gradually transitions into hybrid mechanical electrical engines that pave the way for early automobiles and proto-aeronautical experiments. As Europe's cities electrify and industrialize, a sense of transformative optimism permeates the cultural consciousness. People believe they are standing on the threshold of an era in which humanity might finally transcend the limitations imposed by nature, ignorance, and poverty. But progress always comes with a shadow. The empire's vast bureaucracy becomes increasingly dependent on information systems that require constant maintenance, oversight, and standardization. The administrative apparatus grows so large that entire institutions are created solely to manage other institutions. Critics emerge, philosophers, economists, and political theorists, who warn that a society built on efficiency and centralization risks losing its capacity for spontaneity, creativity, and dissent.
As the 20th century begins, the Napoleonic Empire confronts a new epoch defined not by territorial conquest or political consolidation, but by the transformative power of technology and the shifting identity of a civilization that has known only unity for nearly a century. The children born into this era no longer remember a Europe of competing kingdoms, fragile alliances, and recurrent wars. Instead, they inherit a continent where borders exist primarily as administrative lines, where universities and industries collaborate across languages and cultures, and where the imperial government orchestrates vast initiatives that span thousands of kilometers. This sense of continental citizenship becomes one of the defining traits of the new century, shaping every aspect of society from education to economics. The first decades of the century witness a surge of technological innovation driven by imperial research councils established during the previous generation. These councils fund groundbreaking experiments in electricity, radio transmission, automotive engineering, and early aeronautics. The empire's emphasis on interdisciplinary collaboration accelerates the pace of discovery, allowing scientists to move from theoretical speculation to practical implementation with remarkable efficiency. Laboratories in Paris and Vienna produce some of the earliest prototypes of internal combustion engines optimized for efficiency, while teams in Munich and Milan develop lightweight alloys that transform mechanical design. These advancements lead to early automobiles that become accessible not only to the wealthy, but to the growing middle class empowered by decades of economic stability. At the same time, experiments in aviation, pushed by military engineers, evolve into the first practical airborne vehicles.
Unlike the scattered and competitive development that occurred in real history, the empire's unified infrastructure allows research groups to pool knowledge, share resources, and test large-scale prototypes across multiple sites. This cooperation dramatically accelerates the transition from balloon-based flight to controlled, powered aircraft. By the early 1910s, the empire unveils its first standardized line of military and civilian aircraft, symbolizing both technological triumph and the emergence of a new strategic dimension in geopolitics. This expansion of air power reshapes diplomatic relations. Britain, aware that European technological progress threatens to outpace its naval dominance, accelerates its own aeronautical research programs. The resulting rivalry becomes one of scientific competition rather than military confrontation, as each side aims to achieve breakthroughs in aviation, communication, and early computational technologies. This competition stimulates global innovation, but it also deepens the ideological divide between two visions of modernity: the centralized, technocratic continental order of the Napoleonic Empire and the liberal, commercially driven global network of the British Commonwealth. As the 20th century progresses, the empire enjoys remarkable internal stability, but its sheer size and complexity introduce new challenges. The administrative machine that once served as the backbone of unity now struggles to adapt to the social and cultural diversification of industrial society. Urban centers such as Paris, Berlin, Barcelona, and Prague become melting pots of intellectual debate, artistic experimentation, and political expression. Factories attract workers from every corner of the continent, creating a multicultural urban proletariat whose aspirations extend far beyond economic security. They seek mobility, rights, representation, and cultural recognition. The empire, built on rationalism and institutional order, must now grapple with the unpredictability of mass society. Public discourse intensifies as newspapers, radio broadcasts, and public lectures bring political ideas to millions. Intellectuals debate the future of the empire. Should it remain a technocratic federation guided by expertise, or should it evolve into a more democratic state responsive to public opinion? These debates are amplified by new communication technologies that spread ideas faster than the imperial bureaucracy can process.
Yet beneath these reforms lies an unspoken concern. The empire must remain coherent, or everything built since Waterloo could unravel. The leadership understands that accommodating diversity without compromising unity requires delicate political engineering. A series of educational initiatives are launched to reinforce the shared values of discipline, rationality, and civic responsibility. Civic education becomes mandatory across all levels of schooling, instilling in students a sense of belonging to a continental project larger than any single nation or culture. Critics worry that these programs verge on ideological indoctrination, but supporters argue that without a cohesive identity, the empire risks fragmentation. Meanwhile, advances in technology begin to reveal a world far more interconnected and far more vulnerable than any previous generation could have imagined. Early computational devices based on mechanical and electromechanical principles are developed in research centers across the empire. These machines assist with census data, industrial planning, military logistics, and scientific simulations. Although primitive by later standards, they represent a profound shift in how human society processes information. For the first time, the empire can make decisions using real-time data aggregated from dozens of provinces and millions of citizens. This capability strengthens central governance, but also raises new ethical questions about privacy, autonomy, and the balance of power between the state and the individual. These debates reach a critical point during the turbulent economic cycles of the 1920s. While the empire is largely insulated from the market crashes that destabilize other parts of the world, its centralized planning system faces internal strains. Rapid urbanization outpaces infrastructure capacity. Food distribution networks, once flawlessly efficient, begin to crack under the pressure of population growth. Industrial pollution reaches unprecedented levels in major cities, leading to the first organized environmental movements. Public health crises force the empire to confront the unintended consequences of industrial modernity, prompting sweeping reforms in sanitation, housing, and urban planning. Cultural life undergoes its own upheaval. Artists, writers, and filmmakers reject the grand, rationalistic aesthetic of earlier generations in favor of movements that explore emotion, identity, and the subconscious. Expressionism, futurism, and abstract art flourish under imperial protection, turning Europe into a laboratory of cultural reinvention. Theaters stage daring productions that challenge conventional morality and authority. The empire, rather than suppressing these developments, embraces them as signs of a dynamic society capable of self-reflection. Yet these cultural revolutions also fuel political radicalization, inspiring movements that question the legitimacy of imperial hierarchy. At the same time, new global tensions emerge as the world's two great powers, the Napoleonic Empire and the British Commonwealth, increasingly compete for influence in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Their rivalry remains political and economic rather than military, but its intensity grows as technological advancements make global domination a plausible ambition. Britain leverages its naval supremacy to control maritime trade routes, while the empire uses its scientific and industrial dominance to project soft power through infrastructure, education, and technological exports. These competing strategies reshape the geopolitics of emerging nations, forcing them to choose between two models of modernization. Despite these tensions, the world avoids the catastrophic wars that defined early 20th century history in the original timeline. The presence of two balanced superpowers creates a deterrent dynamic in which neither side is willing to risk total conflict. Instead, scientific competition becomes the primary vehicle for rivalry. Both the Empire and Britain invest heavily in physics, chemistry, aeronautics, and early nuclear research. Imperial laboratories make groundbreaking discoveries in quantum mechanics and atomic theory, propelled by the Empire's unparalleled ability to coordinate human capital. As research accelerates, scientists begin to unlock the secrets of subatomic structure, inadvertently setting the stage for a technological revolution that will redefine the century. By the early 1930s, the empire stands at a crossroads. Its achievements are monumental. A century of peace within its borders, unprecedented technological progress, a unified economic system, and a cultural renaissance unmatched in history. Yet its challenges are equally formidable. Rising demands for political representation, the moral implications of technological power, environmental degradation, and the growing complexity of a society that no longer fits neatly within the bureaucratic structures created in the Napoleonic age. The question now facing Europe is no longer whether the empire can endure external threats, it has long since proven its resilience, but whether it can adapt to the internal transformations of a world it helped create. The empire's fate will depend on how it reconciles authority with freedom, unity with diversity, and technological ambition with human values. And as the century unfolds, new forces, intellectual, political, and scientific, begin to emerge, carrying the potential to either elevate the Napoleonic world order to unprecedented heights or unravel it in ways no one can foresee.
In the aftermath of Napoleon's decisive victory at Waterloo, the political map of Europe begins to shift with an almost gravitational inevitability. The shock that ripples through the continent is not merely military, it is ideological, psychological, civilizational. Napoleon, once considered a fading ember of an era soon to be extinguished, is now reborn as a force that seems capable of reshaping the 19th century according to a vision that, until this moment, appeared destined for historical speculation instead of reality. Across Europe, monarchies tremble. The courts of Vienna, Berlin, and St. Petersburg enter states of feverish emergency. The Holy Alliance, still in its infancy, fractures before it even consolidates, for its entire premise rested on Napoleon's fall. With his return to dominance unquestionable, the very idea of maintaining the old aristocratic order becomes increasingly untenable. In Paris, the triumphant emperor moves quickly, understanding that victory on the battlefield means little unless it is anchored by victory in policy, administration, and reconstruction. His goal is not a reckless expansion, but a carefully architected consolidation of power that can withstand the storms of international opposition. France under Napoleon experiences a renaissance of state energy. The industrial reforms he once initiated now accelerate with unprecedented velocity. Railways, still an emerging technology, begin receiving targeted imperial investment. In this timeline, France becomes the first continental power to recognize the transformative potential of the locomotive, not as a curiosity, but as the backbone of future economic power. The emperor, fascinated by engineering, invites leading British, Belgian, and German innovators to Paris, offering them protection, funding, and influence. Many accept, fearing political instability at home, or driven by the sheer magnetism of scientific opportunity within Napoleon's reorganized empire. Yet this is not merely an economic transformation, it is a cultural one. The French Empire, often stereotyped by its enemies as a military machine, begins projecting itself as the intellectual core of Europe. Universities, reformed earlier in Napoleon's rule, expand their mandates into research fields unimaginable only a decade prior. New academies dedicated to chemistry, astronomy, and political science emerge. Paris becomes the gravitational center of the European intelligentsia, pulling in minds from Poland, Italy, and even reluctant corners of Britain. But while France ascends, Britain faces a crisis that reaches far deeper than military defeat. The political blow of losing to Napoleon undermines parliamentary stability and triggers a wave of introspection across the nation. Questions arise in London that had once belonged only to the radical fringes. Has Britain overextended itself?
Can the empire maintain global dominance if Europe is united under a single strategic authority? Should domestic reform precede imperial ambition? The debates slowly fracture long-standing alignments between conservatives and reformists, creating an internal turbulence that reshapes British politics for decades.
Meanwhile, Prussia suffers an existential wound. At Waterloo, its forces under Blücher suffer catastrophic losses alongside Wellington. In this alternate history, Prussia's dream of rising to a unified German leadership collapses before it fully takes shape. The prestige needed for such a mission had always been fragile. Now it is shattered. A defeated, weakened, and partially occupied Prussia becomes a secondary state in the European system, its ambitions overtaken by the gravitational pull of Napoleon's reorganized continental order. The German Confederation, which historically emerged after Napoleon's defeat, never materializes in its intended form. Instead, Napoleon restructures the German world into a more centralized and French-aligned system, one that preserves local identities but subjects them to an imperial strategic framework. This slows the process of German nationalism that would historically lead to unification under Prussia. In this altered Europe, the 19th century becomes dominated not by a rising Germany, but by a France that stabilizes the continent through a mixture of modernization, diplomacy, and carefully calibrated authority. Russia, however, remains the greatest unresolved variable. Tsar Alexander I, deeply religious, erratic, and hostile to Napoleon, views the French emperor's survival as a personal affront to divine order. Russia begins preparing for a long, ideological confrontation with the French-led continent. Yet even here, reality intervenes. The logistical constraints of waging war across Europe remain immense. The Russian Empire, vast but technologically stagnant, cannot immediately challenge a reunified Napoleonic France equipped with modernizing industry. Thus, a cold rivalry forms, a tense balance reminiscent of geopolitical duels in later centuries, where ideology, technology, and influence replace direct military confrontation as the tools of competition. As France consolidates its power, the Americas watch with a mixture of fascination and anxiety. In the United States, policymakers realize that the Monroe Doctrine, a concept barely beginning to form in this timeline, may need to evolve into something much stronger if European unity threatens hemispheric independence. Napoleon himself is wary of direct intervention across the Atlantic, but is increasingly interested in projecting cultural and commercial influence rather than military force. The French Caribbean and strategic footholds in West Africa become centers for expanded trade routes, scientific expeditions, and naval projects that point toward a future global presence, not necessarily one of conquest, but one of competitive reach. What emerges over the next decade is a Europe that, while not completely dominated by Napoleon, is undeniably shaped by him. His victory at Waterloo becomes more than a military triumph. It becomes a fulcrum upon which the entire 19th century pivots. The revolutions of 1848, historically inevitable, unfold in a profoundly altered context. Without the reactionary policies of the restored monarchies, the revolutionary wave takes on different forms, less anti-monarchical, more ideological, driven by industrialization, education, and changing social structures. France itself does not collapse into the instability that historically plagued it after Napoleon's downfall. Instead, it undergoes controlled reforms supervised by a competent technocratic elite shaped by decades of centralized administration. This altered Europe does not eliminate conflict, but it reframes it. The central tension becomes not between monarchs and republics, but between models of modernization. Napoleon's empire champions a state-guided modernization framework, while Britain advocates a liberal, market-driven alternative. Russia pushes a conservative, spiritual model resistant to Westernization. These ideological blocs begin shaping global alignments in ways that anticipate the complexities of future centuries. Yet, beneath the surface of imperial stability lies a deeper question, one that historians, philosophers, and statesmen in this alternate world ponder with increasing intensity. Can an empire built on a single individual's ambition endure beyond his lifetime? Napoleon, aware of his mortality, attempts to secure a long-term institutional structure capable of surviving succession. He revises legal codes, decentralizes certain administrative functions, and elevates capable technocrats who could stabilize the empire after his death. But no matter how carefully he plans, the central paradox of his empire remains unresolved. An empire of reforms born from the will of one man must eventually face the absence of that man. As the decades progress, the world shaped by Napoleon's victory becomes a stage on which new challenges emerge. Industrialization accelerates, scientific breakthroughs reshape economies, railways connect continents, telegraph lines shrink distances. And within this rapidly changing world, the French Empire stands as both a stabilizer and a catalyst, an entity whose existence continually reshapes the destiny of Europe. But even as the empire strengthens, the seeds of future tensions quietly root tree. The younger generation of Europeans, educated, connected, ambitious, begins questioning the centralized structure of power. National identities evolve in new, unpredictable directions. Former enemies become unexpected partners. Former allies question their roles. The continent stands balanced between order and transformation, between unity and fracture. And through it all, the world continues to ask the same question, whispered across classrooms, parliaments, and military academies. If Napoleon's victory at Waterloo reshaped the 19th century, how long will the echo of that moment, one June day in 1815, continue to reverberate through the centuries to come?
As the decades unfold, the world shaped by Napoleon's impossible victory slowly approaches a moment of profound reckoning. What began as a single altered event on the muddy fields of Waterloo has now matured into an entire alternate civilization, one defined not only by France's ascendance, but by the deep and lasting transformation of Europe's very identity. The question historians ask in this timeline is no longer simply what Napoleon achieved, but what the world became because of him, and what new trajectory humanity followed in the shadow of an empire that survived when it was destined to fall. Napoleon's final years unfold with an almost mythic aura. He is no longer the young general driven by restless ambition, but a statesman shaped by decades of power, victory, and responsibility. His hair grays, his voice grows softer, yet his presence remains electrifying. Foreign envoys still travel across the continent to stand before him, seeking his advice, fearing his disapproval, calculating his moves with obsessive precision. For even as age claims him, the emperor's mind remains sharp, analytical, constantly mapping the future of Europe as if it were a grand campaign awaiting execution. He spends these last years drafting reforms designed to endure long after his death. The Imperial Academy of Sciences expands its authority into areas that will one day shape modern life: steam power, electrical research, public health, agriculture, and transportation. Ministries plan rail networks that will link Paris with Warsaw, Milan, Amsterdam, and the farthest reaches of the empire. Napoleon invests heavily in education, convinced that the future strength of France lies not in armies, but in minds. He often tells his advisors that victories on the battlefield fade, but victories in knowledge echo for centuries.
Yet even as the emperor works to secure a lasting order, events outside his control begin to reshape the European landscape. The rise of new industries creates powerful commercial elites who view imperial centralization as a constraint rather than a foundation. Intellectual circles across the continent, empowered by Napoleon's own reforms, demand political participation. National identities, Italian, Polish, German, grow increasingly assertive, nurtured by expanded literacy and cultural revival. Ironically, the very forces Napoleon unleashed in his mission to modernize Europe now begin pushing against the unified order he created. Still, the empire holds. It adapts, flexes, reforms. The emperor, despite his pride, recognizes that stability requires evolution, not rigidity. He allows controlled decentralization, creating advisory councils that give regions a political voice. This slows the growth of revolutionary pressure, even if it cannot silence it entirely. Europe becomes a continent guided not by absolute authority, but by a delicate balance between imperial leadership and emerging local aspirations. It remains stable, perhaps remarkably so for such a vast and diverse geopolitical construct.
Napoleon dies quietly, surrounded by his family and closest ministers. His passing sends a shockwave through Europe, unlike anything seen before. Streets across the empire fill with millions of mourners. Bells echo through Paris for days. Foreign leaders, even those who once feared or despised him, send solemn messages acknowledging that his death marks the end of a monumental era. In St. Petersburg, Alexander's successors debate what comes next. In London, Parliament holds a rare moment of silence, not for an ally, but for a man who changed the trajectory of nations. The question, whispered first in salons and universities, but soon shouted across all of Europe, is simple yet terrifying. What now? The succession is peaceful, but the world begins to transform in ways no emperor, however visionary, could have fully predicted. The new French leadership inherits not a battlefield empire, but a modernizing superstate shaped by technologies that alter its foundations faster than politics can adapt. Railways shrink distances. Telegraph lines accelerate decision-making. Factories reshape economies. As industry accelerates, so too does social mobility, urbanization, and the rise of new political ideologies. France remains the dominant power, yet its supremacy now depends not on conquest, but on innovation, diplomacy, and adaptation. Across the continent, younger generations grow up knowing only a Europe unified under French guidance. They do not fear Napoleon as a conqueror. They study him as an architect of the world they inhabit. Their beliefs, ambitions, and dreams differ profoundly from those of their ancestors. They see Europe not as a collection of rival states, but as a cohesive civilization, one that competes with Britain, Russia, the United States, and the rising powers of Asia in fields of science, industry, and culture. The long-term result is a world that never experiences the catastrophic convulsions that historically defined the 19th and early 20th centuries. Without a fragmented Germany, the rivalries that historically led to 2 world wars never reached the same explosive trajectory. Without a weak France plagued by political instability, the continent remains anchored by a stable center. Instead of being torn apart by ideological extremes, Europe becomes an engine of scientific and industrial advancement, propelled by intense but mostly peaceful competition. And yet, despite this stability, the legacy of Napoleon's impossible victory remains a paradox. It gave Europe unity, but also prolonged the struggle between central authority and national identity. It accelerated modernization, but forced generations to negotiate the balance between empire and freedom. It created an unprecedented era of stability, but depended on constant adaptation to survive. In the final analysis, the question, what if Napoleon won at Waterloo, becomes much more than a historical speculation. It becomes a study of how a single event can redirect the flow of global history. A single victory reshapes alliances, economies, ideologies, scientific progress, and cultural evolution. It alters the destinies of nations and the lives of billions yet unborn. For in this alternate world, the Battle of Waterloo is not merely a military triumph, it is the hinge upon which an entire alternate human story swings. And as future historians look back upon this timeline, they see not just the rise of a French emperor, but the birth of a new European century, one that defined not by fragmentation, but by an extraordinary, improbable coherence. A world where Napoleon's star, instead of setting in the rain-soaked fields of Belgium, rises into a far brighter century, leaving us to wonder not only how history changed, but how close our own world came to being shaped by the same hands, and how profoundly different our reality might be if fate had shifted by even the smallest measure on one June afternoon in 1815.